Hi everybody, welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Monday, the 15th of November, where I wanted to put some closure onto Dracula and begin moving into Lovecraft. So you can see in the notes below that the 3 Lovecraft stories we're going to be reading can also be found online. So I've got the links for that if it turns out that you couldn't find that text. Now the text basically has multiple Lovecraft stories in it, so if you're a Lovecraft fan, you might want to read some of the others, but I selected 3 just to illustrate some of his kind of writing. And also, you can see in the notes below that if you submitted in paper number 1 on time, you should have received it back from me. So if it turns out that you submitted in your paper on time and did not receive it from me, please contact me. As you know, you all have the option of doing a revision, so you can take my comments into account and then basically create a revision, and you would submit the revision along with the original graded copy with my comments on it to my email. And you've got up until the ending of the semester to do that, but the sooner the better. And certainly if it turns out that you've got questions or concerns about the revision, if you decide to pursue a revision, then certainly you can contact me. And keep in mind that if you need to review some of the elements of writing a paper, that was discussed on the 4th of October in our class on Monday. And that's also when I included the critical paper handout in the syllabus and other documents folder. In terms of Dracula, at least according to the syllabus, your journal would have already been done and submitted into me, but I gave a bit of an extension up until today's class because I wanted to talk about some Dracula quotation. So that will be due by today, Monday, if you are watching this video on Monday, on the 14th of November, 11:59 p.m. via my email, ruers@gcc.mass.edu via PDF. And I also wanted to draw your attention to a really interesting idea called Dracula Daily. And I've included the link below, that's in section 3, where basically you can sign up to get emails that follow the progress of the novel from a daily perspective. So basically it would start in May and work its way all the way through November. So you would get pieces of the story as they were actually occurring. Obviously, it's going to take you 6 months to get through that story, which is why we're not doing that in class. But it is a very interesting way to consume a somewhat long novel. And I'm hopeful by this particular point in time that you have finished the novel. This is probably the heaviest reading of the semester. As you probably know from Lovecraft's essay, Supernatural Horror and Literature, he's not particularly an easy read, so his 3 short stories may not necessarily be the easiest read. But once we get to The Haunting of Hill House, which is our next text, you'll see that the language is much more contemporary and accessible. So basically, that's the reward for hanging in this far in the semester, is that our ending readings will probably go much more quickly for you. Before we get into Lovecraft or The Haunting of Hill House, I wanted to talk about Dracula and some of the quotes within the novel that I wanted to draw your attention to. And remember that we were talking about that there's lots of different ways that you could go about reading this novel, but one of the ways is thinking about Dracula as foreigner or invading outsider, the other, if you will. And on page 30, or at least my page 30, this would be in chapter 2, Dracula, when he's talking with Harker, says, "We are in Transylvania, and Transylvania is not England. Our ways are not your ways, and there shall be to you many strange things." And of course, part of the fear is that Dracula is this invading conqueror, if you will, a kind of reverse imperialism that's going to taint European society and European bloodlines. Now, we know that Dracula is a very erotic text written in a time of great repression. So the eroticism can't necessarily be obvious, but it's certainly more obvious than what we saw in something like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And for me, this begins on page 46. I believe this is going to be in chapter 3 for you. This is when Jonathan Harker is being attacked by the 3 vampires. Notice the significance of 3 and the idea of Trinity. You might say that this is an unholy Trinity, as these 3 female vampires who are viewed as Dracula's wives basically are going to try to attack Harker. And of course, Dracula pulls them back because they're acting on their own will. I think that's also an interesting idea on gender commentary, that the females need to be pulled back by the male when they take action on their own. But basically, what we're told on page 46, this is the description of the vampires. And Jonathan says that I seem somehow to know their faces and in connection with some dreamy fear, but I could not recollect at the moment how or where. All three had brilliant white teeth that shone like pearls against the ruby of their voluptuous lips. There was something about them that made me uneasy, some longing, and at the same time some deadly fear. I felt in my heart a wicked burning desire that they would kiss me with those red lips. And then he goes on, and he talks about how the fair girl advanced and bent over me till I could feel the movement of her breath upon me. Sweet it was in one sense, honey sweet, and sent the same tingling through the nerves as her voice, but with a bitter underlying the sweet, a bitter offensiveness, as one smells in blood. I was afraid to raise my eyelids, but looked down and saw perfectly under the lashes. The girl went on her knees and bent over me, simply gloating. There was a deliberate voluptuousness which was both thrilling and repulsive. And she arched her neck, and she actually licked her lips like an animal, till I could see in the moonlight the moisture shining on the scarlet lips and on the red tongue as it lapped the white sharp teeth. Lower and lower went her head, as the lips went below the range of my mouth and chin, and seemed almost to fasten on my throat. And then she paused, and I could hear the churning sound of her tongue as it licked her teeth and lips, and could feel the hot breath on my neck. The skin of my throat began to tingle as one's flesh does when the hand that is to tickle it approaches it nearer, nearer. I could feel the soft, shivering touch of the lips on the supersensitive skin of my throat, and the hard dents of two sharp teeth, just touching and pausing there. And as Stephen King talks about in Danse Macabre, this very much seems like an episode that's leading up to oral sex. So it is very erotic. As we continue on, another quote that I wanted to draw your attention to that I had referenced earlier was about Lucy and Mina and how they are in some ways very progressive for their time. Definitely Mina, even though she wants to be of use to Jonathan, is even told at one point that she has a man's brain and that she is quite capable. And then Lucy is in some ways or another, well, very traditional. The idea that she's contemplating multiple suitors makes her a very unusual woman. And at one point she's writing a letter to Mina. Lucy is writing a letter to Mina. And for me, this is on page 66. This would be in chapter 5, where she says that a woman ought to tell her husband everything, don't you think so, dear? And I must be fair. Men like women, certainly their wives, to be quite as fair as they are. And women, I'm afraid, are not always quite as fair as they should be. And then she talks about her 3 suitors, calling them number 1, number 2, and number 3. And then there's a imitation of a horrible Texan accent that goes on when Quincy is trying to propose to Miss Lucy, saying, I know I ain't good enough to regulate the fixins of your little shoes, but I guess if you wait till you find a man that is, you'll join them 7 young women with the lamps when you quit. Won't you just hitch up alongside of me and let us go down the long road together, driving in double harness? So I guess that's what the author Stoker thinks that a Texan sounds like. But then Lucy goes on and says, I know, Mina, you will think me a horrible flirt, though I couldn't help feeling a sort of exultation that he was number 2 in one day. And then she goes on to talk about number 3, and that why are men so noble when we women are so little worthy of them? And then why is it that they can't let a girl marry 3 men? It's on page 68 for me. Or as many as Warner, and save us all this trouble. Which polygamy is a rather surprising suggestion, considering the time period, even in our own time period. And then there's reference in Miss Mina's journal, this is in the beginning of chapter 8, or page 99 for me, about women's appetites. I believe we should have shocked a new woman with our appetites. And again, I was referencing the idea that there's lots of episodes of eating, and certainly Dracula eats and consumes, but also this idea of women wanting more than what the current society allows them for, especially as Mina goes on and says that women should be allowed to see, men and women should be allowed to see each other asleep before proposing or accepting. but I suppose the new woman won't condescend in the future to accept. She will do the proposing herself. Again, a rather modern idea. Not only is it suggestive of sex before marriage, but that the woman becomes the wooer. And then, of course, there is that idea of the 3 blood transfusions when Lucy is being attacked by Dracula, and all 3 men are basically giving their life force, if you will. And not only is it a life force, but it could be viewed as a sexual suggestive idea as well, that the blood represents semen from 3 different men. And one of the reasons why Lucy, after all, she'd said, why can't we marry all 3 men? One of the reasons why Lucy is killed. And of course, the way the men act afterwards, once they have given their blood transfusions, even though that might be a medical impossibility, that Lucy is able to accept all of these different blood types, but they're very weakened afterwards because they've basically given their life force. And one could say that that's very comparable after ejaculation in a sexual union. And in fact, on page 137, there's reference that no man knows till he experiences it, what it is to feel his own life force drawn into the vein of the woman that he loves, which again could be viewed as a reference to semen. That's in chapter 10. And then another quotation that I wanted to draw your attention to is when Arthur finally kills Lucy. And Stephen King has made note of this as well. For me, this is on page 222. And that killing, that murder, is very erotically suggestive. That is in chapter 16. Arthur took the stake and hammer, and when once his mind was set on action, his hands never trembled or even quivered. And then we find out that the thing in the coffin, or he struck with all his might. The thing in the coffin writhed, and hideous blood, curdling screech came from the opened red lips, and the body shook and quivered and twisted in wild contortions. The sharp white teeth clamped together till the lips were cut, and the mouth was smeared with a crimson foam. But Arthur never faltered. He looked like a figure of Thor, as his untrembling arm rose and fell, diving deeper and deeper the mercy-bearing stake, while the blood from the pierced heart welled and spurted up around it. His face was set, and then the writhing and the quivering of the body became less, and the teeth seemed to champ and the face to quiver. Finally, it lay still. And that could be a reference to the moment of orgasm. Probably Dracula is most best known for laying out the folklore that has become basically part of our popular culture of what a vampire is, and specifically what Dracula is. And this begins on page 243, and again, it's become basically common knowledge in our society. Chapter 18. The Nosferatu, which is another name for vampires, and you remember that Nosferatu was a bootleg film version of the novel Dracula. The Nosferatu do not die like the bee when he sting once. Keep in mind this is Van Helsing speaking, so this is supposed to be mimicking the idea of English as a second language. He is only stronger, and being stronger have yet more power to work evil. The vampire which is amongst us of himself is so strong in person as 20 men. He is of cunning more than mortal, for his cunning be the growth of ages. He still have the aids of necromancy, which is, as his etymology imply, the divination by the dead, and all the dead that he can come nigh to are for him at command. He is brute, and more than brute. He is devil and callous, and the heart of him is not. He can, within limitation, appear at will when and where and in any of the forms that are to him. He can, within his range, direct the elements, the storm, the fog, the thunder. He can command all the meaner things, the rat and the owl, and the bat, the moth, and the fox, and the wolf. He can grow and become small. He can at times vanish and come unknown. And then he continues on, for me on page 245. He is known to flourish. He is known everywhere that men have been. In old Greece and old Rome, he flourished in Germany all over, in France, in India, and in China, so far from us in all ways that he is, and the peoples fear him to this day. And then it continues on to talk a little bit about the many historical references, the Slav, the Saxon, the Hun, And then he goes on and says, the vampire live on and cannot die by mere passing of the time. He can flourish when that he can fatten on the blood of the living. Even more, we have amongst us that he can even grow younger, that his vital faculties grow strenuous and seem as though they refresh themselves when his special palpum is plenty. But he cannot flourish without his diet, he eat not as others. Even friend Jonathan, who lived with him for weeks, did never see him to eat, never. He throws no shadow. He make in the mirror no reflex, so again Jonathan observed. He has the strength of many of his hand. Witness again Jonathan when he shut the door against the wolves, and when he helped him with the diligence too. He can transform himself to wolf, as we gather from the ship arrival in Whitby, when he tear open the door, when he tear open the dog. He can be as bad as Madame Mina saw him on the window at Whitby, and his friend John saw him fly from this so near house, and my friend Quincy saw him at the window of Miss Lucy. He can come in mists which he create. That noble ship's captain proved him of this. But from what we know, the distance he can make this mist is limited, and can only be round himself. He come on moonlight rays as elemental dust, as again Jonathan saw in those sisters in the castle of Dracula. He can become so small. We ourselves saw Miss Lucy, ere she was at peace, slip through a hair-breadth space at the tomb door. He can, once he find his way, come out from anything or into anything, no matter how close it can be bound or even fused up with fire. He can see in the dark, no small power this, in a world which is half shut from the light. Ah, but hear me though. He can do all these things, yet he is not free. Nay, he is even more prisoner than the slave of the galley, than the madman in his cell. He cannot go where he lists. He who is not of nature has yet to obey some of nature's laws. Why, we know not. He may not enter anywhere at first, unless there be someone of the household who bid him to come, though afterwards he can come as he pleases. His power ceases, as does that of all evil things, at the coming of the day. Only at certain times can he have limited freedom. If he be not at the place wherein he is bound, he can only change himself at noon, or at exact sunrise or sunset. These things are we told, and in this record of ours we have proof of inference. Thus wherein he can do as he will within his limit, when he have his earth home, his coffin home, his hell home, the place unhallowed, as we saw when he went to the grave of the suicide at Whitby. Still at other times he can only change when the time come. It is said too that he can only pass running water at the slack or the flood of the tide. Then there are things which so afflict him that he has no power, as the garlic we know of, and as a thing sacred, as this symbol, my crucifix, that was amongst us even now, when we resolve. To them he is nothing, but in their presence he takes his place far off and silent with respect. There are others too, which I shall tell you of, lest in our seeking we may need them. The branch of the wild rose on his coffin, keep him, that he move not from it. A sacred bullet fired into the coffin kill him, so that he be true dead. And as for the stake through him, we know already of its peace, or the cut off head that giveth rest. We have seen it with our eyes. And of course, and then there's also reference to Dracula, his name against the Turk over the great river on the very frontier of Turkey land. And of course, we talked about Vlad the Impaler and so forth. And the Draculas were a great and noble race, though now and again Scions who are held by their covels have to yet have dealing with the evil one. And this has basically established, of course, with a few changes here and there, though I like to say that regardless of what the Twilight series says, vampires do not twinkle. Certainly that was not Stoker's vision. But I think these quotations give you an idea of the kind of impact that this novel has had in our culture, as well as some of the ways this novel can be read. So as we move forward from Dracula, we go to Lovecraft. And of course, we began this semester with supernatural horror and literature, where Lovecraft was talking about what he felt were the criteria for a great piece of supernatural horror. And I thought that we could examine 3 of his short stories to see if he's able to duplicate that within his own writing. Now, Lovecraft himself was in very poor health, and there was a family history of dementia. In some ways, his biography is somewhat similar to Edgar Allan Poe. And we talked a little bit about Edgar Allan Poe and some of the struggles that he faced with addiction and also with fear, being buried alive, marrying his young cousin at a young age, and lots of speculation about how he died. The usual story is that he died alone and penniless, drunk in the gutter. More recent scholarship has suggested that he died of rabies. So there's lots of conjecture there that's going on. And Lovecraft is from Rhode Island and would oftentimes write about New England decadence. Keep in mind that New England was the New England, so to speak. So while the Gothic tradition begins in England, we're now moving it into the United States. Perhaps one of the reasons, again, why he was such a fan of Poe, because Poe was able to expose decadence, even though he didn't necessarily place his stories in a particular locale in the way that Lovecraft does. And most of Lovecraft's stories were published in magazines. Many of Poe's were as well. Weird Tales magazines. And he's become a kind of cult figure. His fame occurred after death. And in some ways, he almost is like, it reminds me a little bit of Lord of the Rings and Tolkien, that people who are fans and readers who are fans basically appreciate the universe that Lovecraft has created. And I certainly am not part of that fandom that's that extreme. If you've met anybody who knows Tolkien, again, you can see that they can quote him many times on chapter and verse, Tolkien's universe. I'm not quite at that point. But I do appreciate Lovecraft because of his contributions to the Gothic tradition. One of the reasons why I think Lovecraft is followed is because of his sense of realism. He's able to merge the mythic, and he's created things like Cthulhu, this terrible monstrosity that we will visit in one of his short stories, as well as a university that's known for its programs in the occult, Miskatonic University, that's said to be loosely based on Brown and Harvard University. And also the Necronomicon, which is again part of the Lovecraftian folklore, that this is an evil book. If you know the Evil Dead series films, then perhaps you are familiar with the idea of evil books, that this Necronomicon gives these ancient spells that allows humanity to interact with the former monsters and monstrosities that used to walk the earth and swim in the seas, and perhaps they still do. Lovecraft is very preoccupied with old things. You can see that in his writing, things like astronomy. Unfortunately, Lovecraft was also very xenophobic and very much against the foreign in terms of foreign invading European tradition. Very anti-foreign. He changed his ways towards the ending of his life, but definitely you can see some of that discrimination and racism in his writing. His narrators are oftentimes scientists and scholars who are uncovering the truth. And we see a mix of Gothic and sci-fi because he also talks about space and the connection with aliens from space with the planet. And his endings have twist endings, much like Poe has twist endings. He likes to put, Lovecraft that is, his twist endings in italics, so that it's very hard to miss what the twist is. So I wish he wasn't necessarily being that quite obvious with his twist. And you'll see that his prose has rhythms that are somewhat poetic, much like with Poe. There's lots of dramatic tension, and there's lots of foreshadowing as well. Perhaps the interesting thing about Lovecraft is that there is no ambiguity in the way that we've seen with previous Gothic texts and the way that we will see with future Gothic texts. In Lovecraft, the monster is real, the end. There isn't any way to explain it through a madness or group psychosis or unreliable narrator. In Lovecraft stories, the supernatural element is presented as a reality, and that humanity needs to be very careful not to interact with that supernatural element, which, at least according to Lovecraft, can be done not through just something like the Necronomicon, that evil book, but that angles in particular are a way to interact with other dimensions and other worlds of the supernatural. And keep that in mind when we get to The Haunting of Hill House, which also discusses angles. So I thought what I would do is slow us down a little bit. According to the syllabus, it said that we should talk about the 3 Lovecraft stories, but I thought we could talk about the 3 Lovecraft stories next class. The Outsider, which I think is a wonderful piece. And I'll talk about some of the reasons why when we get there. Pickman's Model, in part because I wanted to talk about the linking of art with supernatural. If we had had time, we would have read The Picture of Dorian Gray, but we by Oscar Wilde, but we don't have time. But at least we've got Pickman's Model. And lastly, the Dunwich Horror, which is the longest of the three stories because this helps to establish that mythical sense that I talked about with Lovecraft, where he talks about things like Cthulhu and the Necronomicon and so forth. And then we will shift to The Haunting of Hill House. And we've got several classes devoted to The Haunting of Hill House. And again, I think that this is going to be a very fast read compared to what you have done thus far this semester. So it's a much more contemporarily written piece. And if you don't have access to The Haunting of Hill House, you can see that I've included a web link to it as well. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about film in relation to The Haunting of Hill House. So that's how we will begin next class. And for today's attendance question, and this will be due in our class discussion forum, November 16th at 8 a.m. Since I was talking about Dracula quotation, I thought I would give you the opportunity to talk about Dracula quotation, for you to identify Dracula quotation that you find to be significant in the novel and briefly explain why. A quotation from Dracula that you find to be significant, and explain why. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about H.P. Lovecraft and beginning a little bit with The Haunting of Hill House. Take care. Bye-bye.